Well, thanks everybody for sharing kind of where you are today. Um, it just helps for me to kind of know and measure. And it's good to know that a lot of people are feeling pretty decent. So I think that's also positive. So I'm going to start with a video, and I do have the crisis line and the crisis text line in the chat. At any time, if you feel triggered, please reach out to one of those resources or a resource at the college. So let's share screen, and there's going to be a little fumbling back and forth. So this is a recording of my son from boarding school a few years ago.
Yeah. There's a letter I wrote to you. I doubt you'll hear it, but if you do, it'd be cool if you were like, hey, I heard it, Charles. Dear God, it's been a long time since we've spoken, but the world around me is so broken. Feel like I'm trapped in a box. I'm choking, people starving and out there others blood soaking. Where are you? Do you even exist in a world where depressed kids split their wrists and mothers hit their kids when they get pissed? Give me some food, please, something to eat. How about some shoes here under my feet? Got nothing to lose, fool, I live in the street. Haven't seen food in a week, let my soul speak. Follow to the mood of the beat. Yesterday a school got shot up. God fell asleep but never got up. It was out there in Connecticut. You didn't have to see their little faces on the internet. Doubt you even remember it. And if you do, I'm sorry for the lack of gratitude. But ignoring my prayers is the wrong attitude. I'm sorry, God. I'm mad at you. Why is there depression? What's the reason for stressing? Am I stuck in hell? How do I get to heaven? Where were you on September 11th? People in the streets screaming, God help us, we're helpless. But you help no one. Did nothing. I think the Christians are bluffing. There's orphans who've never seen their mother's face, and their fathers at some other's place. Kids in Africa who don't know how water tastes. Every night they pray to you, drowning in tears. Lord, please absorb my fears, make things clear. You never respond. Please prove me wrong. Give me a sign. Send me a message into my mind. Something divine I can feel in my spine. Turn my damn water into wine. Make me float when I rhyme, cause right now I don't think that you're there, or at least you don't care. How come kids with cancer, prayers get no answer? Do you hear their mothers when they ask why? God, why does my child have to die? Staring at a vacant sky, beginning to cry. Can you hear that? Do you feel that? This is real rap. God doesn't hear crack, like victims screaming at God. Help, God, please get me out. I'm locked in a stranger's house and they won't let me out. They say God works in mysterious ways. But if you ask me, God's been dead for days. If I'm wrong and it's not like that, explain it to me when you write back.
All right, I'm gonna share presentation. All right, I hope everybody can see. There is my son Charles. As you heard, he was on the video a minute ago, singing a rap song. And Charles was the funniest, most popular kid in school. And yet the funniest, most popular kid in school suffered from depression, became addicted to heroin, and killed himself 5 years ago. This, excuse me, not a good time for my voice to be wavering. So this is a picture of him on homecoming court around 2010. And he's being escorted by his favorite teacher, Miss Fretwell. And this was a proud mama moment. And I really enjoyed this day because he was laughing and he was fun. And I even remember shopping for that purple shirt and tie. Charles always had to have something different. He wore a white tuxedo for 5th grade graduation. For prom, he wore a hat and tails. So he was, you know, he was a little bit on the side of different. And when he would enter a room, all faces would turn towards him like you know, the party had entered, like he had sunshine in his pocket and he was there to hand it out. And it wasn't long after this picture was taken that my son's drug use started to escalate. Now, I didn't understand why. And I didn't know at the time that he was struggling with thoughts of suicide and that he suffered from depression, because from my point of view, it just wasn't obvious. I mean, he was popular, he had a lot of friends, and it just didn't seem to add up. But one thing that always kind of bothered me is that Charles could never be satiated by fun events. So it was just never enough, and he never seemed to be completely filled up, so to speak. And I always wondered what that meant. And I found out later it's the result of something they call a broken reward system. So Charles started managing his depression and anxiety and his thoughts of suicide with drugs and alcohol. And as that use started to escalate, we, of course, became more concerned because he became more cavalier and he was taking more risks. What I didn't know is that those were signs of suicide, and they're also signs of depression. So I remember seeing a message on my son's Facebook page, and this was in the private messages, and this is the first time I ever saw anything that he mentioned about feeling depressed. And at the time I saw this, I guess I thought it was kind of a temporary thing. But it did kind of plant that seed that maybe things weren't going quite as I thought they were. And he would also make his drug deals on his private message in Facebook as well. So one thing that I think is important for everyone to realize is that drug use for pain or for numbing pain or for treating anything is more of a after 2000 thing. So when I grew up in the 70s and you opened a medicine cabinet, you saw Bayer aspirin, you saw Pepto-Bismol, and you saw Band-Aids, and that was about it. So these days you can open a medicine cabinet and you'll see more prescription medications. So at the end of the 90s, when doctors started prescribing more, those medications ended up in the hands of our teens and our young adults who thought, well, I'm in pain, therefore I'm going to use this medication, because that was become normalized in our culture. So what I started seeing on or hearing from my son's counselor is that, or actually our counselor, because my husband and I had our own, because we just didn't know what to do. And he started telling us about these new party drugs that Charles was probably doing, that he had gotten information from others of his patients. And then I started to see those on his chats as well. And these are highly dangerous party drugs shipped in from China. And in our area, kids were taking them and they were dying 30 minutes later. By this time, we had exhausted all available resources to treat my son in Richmond, Virginia. And we had to make a decision on what to do next, because my son seemed to be spiraling out of control and we didn't have anything left to send him to locally. So our counselor recommended a really bold move, and that was to kidnap our son out of his bed and send him to a wilderness program. And you don't do this because you've caught your kid with a beer and a joint. You do this because you think your child's life is truly at risk. And as you can tell from the picture, he didn't love it, but who would want to be kidnapped out of their bed? I mean, this is somebody we paid to kidnap him. So we had to make the decision to introduce a new trauma. It wasn't an easy decision. I look back, I still don't know if it's the right decision. But it really was at the time the only decision we had available, either leave him the way he was. He wasn't addicted yet, but he seemed to be going in that direction. or do something. So we decided to do something. He didn't love that he had to dig a hole that he had to go to the bathroom in. And he didn't love that a hot shower consisted of a sponge and a cold bucket of water. So for 10 weeks, he didn't take a hot shower and he didn't even bathe. And the good thing about wilderness is that he finally got used to it by the end and he started to participate. And we finally got a diagnosis. So for the first time, somebody did a psychological evaluation. And I don't know why that hadn't been done before, but it should have. I mean, they shouldn't prescribe medication until they have a diagnosis. So he was depressed with anxiety and depression, and the depression surprised me. ADHD combined type, which we already knew. And he also was diagnosed with something called cannabis dependence, which is basically that's what he was self-medicating with. Charles also had and had been previously diagnosed with something called delayed sleep phase syndrome. So he wasn't able to fall asleep until like 2 a.m. And then school started at 7:30 a.m. So I know that lack of sleep played into all of his issues. You'll see in his hands there a bunch of notebooks. And what Charles did was he started managing his emotions once he was away by writing. And he became a prolific writer, and he started writing rap, one of which you saw at the beginning. And that was kind of done off the fly, and I never saw that until after he died. His friend Max had sent that to me. And in these notebooks, he wrote down how he felt via rap music, because if you think about it, there are really not a lot of ways that males in particular are allowed to express themselves. And rap music is one way they're allowed to do that. So that's what Charles chose. So it was from Wilderness that Charles went to therapeutic boarding school. And we didn't have a therapeutic boarding school budget, but I had a little 401k that I'd had from a company that I'd previously worked for. And that's what we used to pay for the boarding school option. So what is a therapeutic boarding school? It is therapy and school combined. It's usually off in the middle of nowhere. It's very restrictive. And of course, he hated it. And they're very careful about making sure no drugs and alcohol get into the school, because they want the kids who are there to work on their issues. And there's a psychiatrist who was part of the staff. And it was my hope that Charles would find a medication and get the toolbox to be able to manage some of his emotions. I'm still unaware that my child is struggling with thoughts of suicide. I know he was evaluated at this therapeutic boarding school. I know he'd been evaluated with other mental health professionals. Even at the age of under 18, no one was sharing with me that my child was a suicide risk. And I do remember asking at least 2 mental health professionals about suicide. And I remember that word just hanging in the air. And it hung in the air so long, I just wanted to snatch it out of the air and put it in my pocket. But they would glaze right over it and not address it. And I really couldn't figure out why. And I think that even for the mental health professionals, it was an uncomfortable subject. But had I known, I might have been able to prevent his suicide. This is my son when he came back from boarding school, having spent about 22 months outside our home in some kind of placement. He loved us dearly, but he was still angry with us because he felt like we had robbed him of years that were his. And I could understand his feeling that way. And I was very frank with him and told him why we did what we did. Now, at this time, he comes home, and by now he's pretty jaded against the mental health system because, quite frankly, it took a really long time. And that is where Charles got most of his shame. we've been shamed multiple times by mental health professionals. So we're in a place that we expected to be treated with respect. We weren't. Now, this is back in 2014. So hopefully things have changed. I know they've changed here, but not with every provider. So my son actually started to regress and revert more to coping with his thoughts of suicide with drugs and alcohol again. Now, I'm not doing as much drug testing, so I really don't know. And Charles did his drugs mostly at night when we were in bed. And eventually, my son became addicted to heroin. And I didn't know it. And I'd say for 9 months, he lived in our house as a person addicted to heroin, and I didn't even know it. And I could tell there were some odd things, but there wasn't any one thing that pointed to a heroin addiction. For one thing, he didn't shoot up, he snorted it. So it wasn't like I had missing spoons or tinfoil or any other paraphernalia. So what happened was that eventually Charles ends up confessing that he is addicted to an opiate. And he never said heroin because that word alone just drips with shame. And he ends up going to detox, then rehab, then recovery house. He is at that recovery house. We're feeling pretty good because he looked really good coming out of rehab, and he relapses within 24 hours. And it was their protocol to take him back to detox. But on their way, they took him to the psych hospital, and the psych hospital refused to do a suicide screen because at the time they refused to screen anybody who was addicted to heroin. And they said, quote, unquote, "We don't treat those people." So there's already a huge stigma with mental illness, even bigger with drug addiction. And so once he'd left the detox unit, he saw a friend, he walked out, and for 2 weeks, we don't know where he is. I don't know if he's sleeping under a bridge or at a friend's house. We get the occasional text message, and we got 2 phone calls. And my husband and I were eating in a restaurant in Richmond, Virginia, and the police called on my husband's cell phone, and they met us in this parking lot. And it was in the back of a police car in this parking lot that we got the worst news of our lives. And they told us that our son had been found dead that morning. And about a minute later, my husband takes a break from all the screaming and wailing, and he says, "How did he die?" And I remember thinking, that was such a crazy question. I mean, how do you think he died? He was addicted to heroin. It had to be overdose. And just as my mind is telling me that, the police said it's a suicide, and the method left no question. It was this extra twist of a knife. And the first thought I have is, how could I be such a crummy mother that my child would check out on me? Didn't he love us? It would be a long time before I would understand suicide, but it wasn't about me, and it wasn't something I did. My son suffered unimaginable pain with the withdrawal from heroin and his mental illness when he took his own life. He felt he was a burden and that we would all be better off without him. So his brain lied to him in that moment when he took his life. So we had a memorial service, but before that, we drove home that night and we collapsed in a pile of pain on the kitchen floor. And I remember thinking, I can't survive this. I will never, ever survive this. How am I going to make it? How am I going to live through the suicide of my child? And then I stopped myself, and I don't know where this came from. And I said, I am going to survive. I am. I didn't know how. I didn't know what that journey looked like. I was scared to death at what it would look like and what it would feel like and how much it would hurt. But I told myself other people had done it, and so could I. Second thing I told myself was that as bad as it was right then, and it was brutal, it would never be as bad as getting the news. I had survived that. It would never hurt that much again. And that's how I got from 1 minute to the next. It will never hurt as much as getting that news, as much as it hurts now. And if you made it through that, you can make it through anything. So one long after the memorial service, I would run into people, and all I wanted to do was talk about my child. And I didn't need a lot of time. I just needed a couple of minutes, because what I was looking for is for people to share those stories I remember and tell me those stories about when he was a little boy. I needed those. I wasn't going to get any new stories. What happened instead, when I would start to talk about him, people would cut me off mid-sentence. And I couldn't figure out why they were doing that. I mean, it was like they expected me to erase him from my family tree. And they expected me maybe to go home and take my ugly, naked mama grief and suffer all by myself and maybe come back out when I was feeling better. I wasn't really sure, but I know that there was a very uncomfortable nature about a child dying, and a child dying from a drug-related illness, and particularly a suicide. So there's just all this stigma surrounding it. And it was because of all the silence surrounding this subject that I didn't recognize some classic signs of suicide in my son. So I went home, and instead of cuddling up with my grief all by myself, I did just the opposite. And I went public with it. I spent 5 months writing this story about my son. And I remember I would open the file and I would go through a box of Kleenex, but at the end of the day, I felt this release from having written and shared our story. And there was something very therapeutic and cathartic about that process. So from August to December, I'm writing this article, and I sent it off to the editor, and it felt so good. I felt like I've really accomplished something, because when you are in that painful, deep grief, it is so hard to put 2 sentences together and concentrate to do anything. And I remember it was quite different when the article actually came out and they told me that it was published in the newspaper. And that's when I panicked, because I thought, what have I done? I have shared our most personal, our most tragic story and my ugly parenting to the entire world. And then I thought, it's no big deal. Nobody will ever read it. You know, I'm not worried about it. So I went home and I shared it with my family, because they didn't know that I wrote it. And I should have told them before I actually had it published, by the way, but I wasn't thinking. And the article went viral. I never thought anybody would read it, and it went viral. And it went viral because other people were reading their story in mine. They had loved ones who struggled with addiction or mental illness, or they had lost somebody to addiction or mental illness, or the person was somebody who struggled with one or the other. 2,000 comments from all over the world, and I read every one of those stories because I was just so honored they read mine. And then I just started a blog called Emotionally Naked to find healing through writing and shine a spotlight on taboo topics of mental illness, grief, suicide, all the stuff that everyone wants to talk about. And then my followers and subscribers talked me into writing a book. And so I wrote a book. But around 2016, I was facing my son's first death anniversary. So he died in June of 2015, and our first death anniversary would have been June of 2016. Now, I will tell you, after you lose somebody very close, all those firsts are difficult. The first birthday, the first grief anniversary, the first holidays, they can be tough for the rest of your life, but that first year is particularly difficult. So I wrote about it because that is how I was dealing with most anything anyway. And so I wrote about it and I called it The Final 48 Hours. And I published it, but I remember being sort of ashamed and embarrassed that I posted it. And it basically was about us getting the news and how we reacted. I mean, it's an agonizing article. And I thought, why would anybody read this? And why on earth would I publish it? And about 2 days after I published it and about 100,000 people had read it, I get a note from a girl named Lauren, and it said, 2 days ago, I thought about taking my life. Reading a post from a mother who's felt such devastating pain has changed my perspective on life. And she reached out to her parents and told them what she had been wanting to tell them 4.5 years, that she suffered from depression and thoughts of suicide. She asked for help. And that was the first time I ever recognized that people who struggle with thoughts of suicide want to tell. This was a turning point for me. I recognized that the universe was pushing me in this direction. I had a digital marketing business and I just didn't care about it anymore. I kept thinking I would get this passion back, and it just didn't happen. And I give Lauren credit for that. So she had seen the article on a friend of her mother's Facebook page. And it just validated what she already wanted to do, which was tell someone. And I'm so glad she did, because at 22, she went into college, and 3 years later, she graduated. So I started writing some articles that would, when people went to Google and searched certain ways to die, that they would land on pages that I had written on my blog. I was a digital marketing professional. I knew how to do search engine optimization, which is basically figuring out the Google algorithm and how your article can rank higher when people look up things. And I wanted to compete with pages that were offering step-by-step instructions. And there are days when I'm doing what I'm doing and I think, nobody's listening. And then I get a message like this. These never get old. Never get old. I have hundreds of them now. And to think some stranger would take the time to send me a comment in the middle of the night or find me on Facebook to say, this post saved my life last night. And then I also have to remember that I'm the one that's going to carry my son's legacy forward. And to do that, I have to keep doing what I'm doing. So what I'm going to show you next are some of the tweets that my son posted, because what I want you to see is what it looks like when people post things and they're struggling, because they want to tell, and they're not going to tell you in the most direct way. About 90% are going to be vague. And because it's such a sensitive subject, and it is really hard to share your darkest, most deepest, awful, ugly soul confession with somebody. That takes a whole lot of courage. So this first tweet is kind of one of Charles's normal tweets. And I was blocked from his Twitter at that time, so I didn't see any of these next tweets. If I died, no one would notice for at least a month. This one could have been a bullet point under the phrase, what do people thinking of suicide say? And it's not just what he says here. It is how that makes you feel. And for a lot of people, they kind of push back. Oh no, this is too big. I'm not qualified. What I'm empowering you today is if you see a message like this, you realize it's going to feel uncomfortable. Your brain's going to say, oh, you're not qualified, but you are. If you can listen and communicate with someone, you have the ability to prevent suicide, because 9 times out of 10, they're going to tell you and not a mental health professional. So just having some basic listening skills and understanding. So we need a lot of eyes out there. If you want to see who really cares about you, see who's there when you have nothing. Death sounds nice. A lot of people thought this meant he had hit rock bottom, which, by the way, is a huge myth. And it meant that he wanted help. And he was screaming for it. And it does still make me sad to think that none of us really knew that. So what do people thinking of suicide say? They talk about ending their lives, having no reason to live, being a burden to others, feeling trapped or unbearable pain. They'll say simple things like, I can't do this anymore. Sometimes they say it by text. Sometimes they post it on social media. It's really that gut feeling you get of like, this doesn't add up. And you're wondering, well, what do I do? You reach out to that friend and you ask the question, are you thinking of suicide? You don't say, are you thinking of harming yourself? Because people will say, no, I'm not going to harm myself. I'm going to kill myself. So you have to ask it directly. Are you thinking of killing yourself? That is a really uncomfortable question to ask. And you are going to feel that heart fluttering when you do, like, oh my gosh. And a lot of people worry that their friend will be mad. But I'd rather have a friend mad and alive than dead. So be helpfully nosy. Go ahead and push a little bit. And you can explain why. It's like, I'm pushing because I'm caring. I care about you. Other signs of suicide have to do with behavior, like drinking or drugging a lot, just people going off the rails. Another sign that is very typical is ghosting. So you have this friend, they've been real involved, and all of a sudden they start to fade into background noise. And lots of times people tend to take that personally, like it's something I did, they don't want to hang out with anymore, I'm too ugly, I'm too this. It's not about you. It isn't. Most of the reactions that people have to you have nothing to do with you, but what they're going through at the time. So reach out to that friend. Say, I'm concerned about you. I haven't seen you in a while. I think we need to sit down and chat. Be slightly pushy, because if somebody is retreating, they're isolating, and that is a sign of suicide. I call suicide brain attack because it is this irrational moment where somebody just isn't thinking right, and they are in this tunnel vision, and it takes about anywhere from 5 minutes to 20 minutes is a typical time that people are struggling with thoughts of suicide. So it is a moment where somebody is struggling with so much emotional pain, and the time that they think that they can wait for relief is too long. So people who are struggling with thoughts of suicide usually just want to end the pain. They don't really want to kill themselves. So I usually equate it to, I'm standing in a house that's on fire, and there's a bucket of water next to me, and I'm on fire. There's a bucket, I grab the bucket, I'm going to pour it over my head because that's going to stop the flames. It's going to stop the pain, right? And that's kind of like suicide. Is I'm in pain, and they grab something that is a means to end their life. This is one way suicide's been described to me by teens and young adults. It's not this way for everybody, but just to kind of give you an example, this is a 20-minute time frame, and several people have said the first peak is really, really hard. And once that first peak eases off, it's that you feel ambivalent to death. And then the peak happens again, and the intensity of, I've got to stop this pain, I've got to stop this pain, and then it drops off again. At every point in this graph, the person who struggles with thoughts of suicide is ambivalent about death. Kevin Hines launched himself off the Golden Gate Bridge, and he lived to tell about it. He said the moment those hands left the rail, he regretted that decision. So just know when you are talking to somebody who is struggling with thoughts of suicide, there is that battle going on in their head of ambivalence. So what do? Really listening is your most important step. We don't want to say things like, oh, you have so much to live for, you've got so much, you're so popular. People in that kind of pain, we need to connect with the pain. And really all you need to say is, I'm so sorry you feel that way, tell me more. And then just listen. And it is really hard to sit with somebody else in their pain. And there may be stretches of silence that are uncomfortable. But it's really about being there, and it's about the art of listening. Now, I've listed a few transitions where people your age can start to get into trouble or start to feel more vulnerable to suicide. Now, for somebody to be suicidal, they have to be vulnerable in the first place. And that can be caused by multiple things. So sometimes it's health history, sometimes it's environment. Oftentimes it's a background of having a mental illness such as depression. Not everybody that has depression is suicidal, and not everybody that's suicidal has depression. But depression does bring on thoughts of suicide. And then there are other things that happen in their life, and it's usually a constellation of factors that happen all at one time. And it can be person having a major grief episode, and they're starting to drink and drug too much, and then a loved one that's very close to them dies, and then they start getting bad grades. So it just kind of is a cluster of things that happen at once. And we'll often see newspaper articles saying that 12-year-old kills herself because of bullying. No, it's never just one thing. Millions of children every year are bullied, and they don't kill themselves. The child had to have been vulnerable to suicide. Maybe there was trauma at home. Other things were going on in her life. Maybe she did have a mental illness. So it's multiple things going on at one time. And here's that phrase again, tell me more. Those are the magic words. Now, when you connect with somebody, you want to connect with their pain. You want to give them enough time to tell you their story. And then you want to say, you know, this is really serious and I'm concerned about you. Let's call the crisis text line together or text it together. Or let's call this local resource, or let's go by the school counselor. You want to show that partnership of, I'm not sure what the next step is, but let's call somebody that can help us so that they know you're in that process with them and that you want to help them and take that next step. So there have often been times when I look back and I thought, how did my cute, bubbly, fun, adorable little toddler get depression and then become addicted to heroin and die by suicide? And I went through a very long period of self-blame, that this was all my fault and I had done something that caused this. And kind of like when I said at the beginning I would survive, when I got in those really bad days, I would tell myself, you know what, one day I'm going to forgive myself. I'm going to forgive myself because I can't torture myself like this my whole life. But that coulda, woulda, shoulda piece is something you go through when in grief, especially after a suicide. And when I went back and I looked at all the old VHS videos from the 90s of my sons playing, and we baked birthday cakes and we went to the beach and to parks and to the library, and we did slip and slide in the backyard. And you know what? We ate popsicles out on the driveway when it was 90 degrees with it all dripping all over us. We were a normal family. We did normal family things. There wasn't something that I did that specifically triggered this in my child. And that was the part that I needed to forgive myself about. I also needed to understand that numbing the pain wouldn't help me be able to move forward. In fact, I met with somebody who said the only way I can make it through having lost my son is I have to drink heavily every day. And 7 years later, this guy was stuck in the same place. And I had lunch with my friend Roz, and she's like planning vacation. And I mean, she'd lost her son 7 years earlier, and she was planning a vacation. And I'm like, you're like normal. And she said, yeah, you'll get back to a normal life. And that's when I realized I needed to feel the feelings. And that's what writing did for me. It allowed me to feel the feelings and express them. And I could endure that pain because, like everything, the pain was temporary. So all emotions are temporary. And just when I couldn't take those grief episodes, it feels like it's an elephant on your chest, it lifts and you feel better. So it does come in waves and you do get relief. I made the decision to not to drink alcohol. I didn't do drugs because I thought that could be a potentially slippery slope. And I recognized I couldn't heal if I couldn't feel. It wasn't going to help me to run to the bar because guess what? He's still going to be dead the next day. And it's still going to hurt. Only I'm going to have a hangover in addition to the hurt and pain that I already had. So I wasn't a big drinker in the first place, but I just made that decision for myself. And I just stuck with it. I don't drink anymore. And that does bring up a lot of questions with people. But I saw that it didn't help my child, and I figured it wouldn't help me either. So another thing I did to help cope was to run. And I'm not a good runner, and I run like a dead chicken. And if you saw me, you'd be like, wow, and she's not very good. But it wasn't about any of that. And I remember a few mornings it was 12 degrees and I was crying and it made my eyelashes freeze. But by the end of the run, I just felt a release. So getting outside and doing exercise when you're struggling with anything really does work. And it's so simple. And of course, it can't be ashes outside when you do that. But changing your environment is always a good idea when you're struggling with something. And I also look for support. So a lot of people think that reaching out and asking for help or finding support is weak. And I'm not sure where we get that in our culture because it's not true. I think asking for help and support are the most courageous things you could do. And it was a big deal for me to go to support groups and get the help that I needed, because it just made all the difference to be with other people who had lost someone to suicide and understood those coulda, woulda, shouldas and those what ifs and those difficult stages. And it gave me a group of people with whom to go through this with. And I also made the decision that somebody had said, you should wake up every morning and think of 3 things you're grateful for. Well, I wasn't capable of that after he died. I could barely take a shower. I couldn't even remember to take off my pajamas before I got in the shower. I mean, it was bad. So I thought, I'll just think of one thing. And I wasn't very good at this at first, but I stuck with it. And after a while, I noticed it kind of set an intention for the day for me. And I'm going to tell you a story, and then we're going to do a little quick kind of workshop where I'm going to ask for your participation in the chat. And I remember after he died, there was a young lady who shared a story with me about Charles. And she said, Mrs. Rogers, I suffer from depression. And one day that depression had taken her hostage. And it took a Herculean effort for her to get out of bed and get to school that day, but she did. She is standing in the hallway with a bunch of her friends, and she's trying to wear the mask of a clown because she didn't want other people to see how depressed she was. She looks up and she sees Charles staring straight at her. And she said, Mrs. Rogers, I knew Charles. Everybody did, but I didn't know he knew me. And we'd never met or spoken to each other. And as soon as she returned eye contact, he makes a beeline and stops about 2 feet in front of her. And then he breaks out into a rap song he created on the spot just for her. I mean, who does that, right? And at first her friends are shocked, and then they die laughing. He finishes up the song, he bends over, he gives her a hug, and he said, pretty girl, shouldn't look so sad. And he made his way down the hall. And I think that as funny and as talented as Charles was, that was his greatest gift, letting other people know that they matter. And that is something that each and every one of us can do every day. And that alone can prevent suicide. It is that connection that really, and that sense of belonging, that is what brings a community together. And that's what prevents suicide. So many of us kind of think that life in terms that you just reach this holy grail of happiness and that you're running through the meadow with daisies and it's all happy. But again, all emotions are temporary. And life has its ups and downs, and it has such beautiful moments. And I've had beautiful moments even since my child died by suicide. But it also has very challenging and difficult moments. And it's always great to have goals, but I think it's even more important to know how you're going to manage those times when it gets really hard. Because there will be a time when it gets really hard. When someone you love is diagnosed with cancer, something happens to you, there's a breakup, you lose someone you love. How are you going to manage it? So think about what coping strategies you might use, because those are triggers to your own thinking of it. Nobody's immune to thoughts of suicide. And what I would like everyone on this call or listening to this recording today is that I want you to think of 2 trusted adults that you would speak to if you were struggling. I'd like you to think of one that's in school and one that is not in school. And I would like for you to picture telling them, that you're struggling with something. Think of something in your past and just picture it, because if you do that, when you get to a place where you are struggling, you have someone you can talk to, a trusted adult. When you are thinking about coping strategies, you have to think, will the long-term use of this strategy help me or hurt me? So if you think of writing, for example, you get writer's cramp. That's the worst thing that can happen, right? But if you do drugs and alcohol, you could become addicted, and that's a slippery slope all its own. And reaching for a substance to solve a problem robs you of the ability to develop those healthy coping strategies. So if I had gone the route of using a bottle of wine every night to resolve it, I wouldn't have developed that emotional muscle. And it is that emotional muscle that was getting built and reinforced, and that my pain had a purpose. My pain had a purpose of healing, and I didn't see it or really feel it then. And it wasn't until I looked back that I saw that I had created the building blocks to emotional healing. And this is what I get a lot from when I do this in person. I do a thing with Post-it notes where people can post how they feel. So I've got to leave behind in the chat, and I would love it if after this event today, you would upload just a piece of paper, you take a picture with your phone, and you upload it to the Google folder that I have provided. I'm going to suggest this as a suicide prevention app. It's one of the best, and it's been around for a long time, and it's been vetted by professionals, and I've used it, and it's really good. And this is just an app when it's creating like a group of 5 people, and if you're having a day where things aren't that great, you have a group of people that you can kind of whine to, basically, that are going to allow you to do that and allow you to vent. And this has been a very popular with teens and young adults. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen, but I would like you to put in the chat examples of unhealthy coping strategies, because I think it helps with awareness to understand ones that are healthy or unhealthy. Unhealthy coping strategies. Let's see. So anybody got any ideas? Further isolation, avoidance, those are big ones. Those are good. Eating, right? Because eating too much can be a problem. Not eating enough could be disordered eating. A lot of people do that. Emotional eating and drinking. Overthinking. That's really good. I haven't heard that one before. Binge eating. Temper. A lot of people with depression are angry. They don't get sad. You expect to see sad, but they're angry. So a lot of people who are struggling with suicide, teen males in particular, they will be really mean to me. I don't care. Because if somebody is struggling that much and is in that much pain, then I have to give them a license to be angry. I would be angry too. Lonely, yeah, isolating, ghosting, as I mentioned earlier. And then the other is share some healthy coping strategies, if you would. Yoga, that's a good one. Exercise in general. Spending time with friends and family, yes. Communicating. Seeing a professional, good. Smiling or expressing, feeling, yeah, I like that. Listening to music, That's good. Getting outside in nature, that was really big for my husband, is that we lived near the river and he would go down by the river every single day. Camping, I like that. I think being outside really helps me a lot. So think about which of those coping strategies you would use if things got really difficult. And we have a few minutes left. Let's see, not long left. Do you guys have any questions? And let me put my email in the chat here. If anybody has any follow-up, let me share with the whole group. Anybody has any follow-up, you can go to Emotionally Naked. And I do have a file that's a leave behind. That has a link to the apps. It has a link to that Google folder. It has a link to some of the best anxiety apps as well. And a short little script on what you do when you're sitting down with a friend and you suspect they may be struggling with thoughts of suicide, and kind of how to ask. It's really short and it's real condensed, but it'll give you a good idea and a framework. I really appreciate everyone being here today. It means a lot that we have a lot of people, and to see some faces is really nice too. So I really appreciate it. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you so much, Anne, for really bringing this important work to our campus today and bringing awareness to suicide prevention and sharing all of these resources with all of us. I know today's subject matter might have been really difficult for some, so thank you to all of you too, all of the attendees for being present with us today. If today's event resonated with you in any way, and if you're comfortable with sharing, please consider filling out the anonymous event evaluation form that was linked in the chat. I'm gonna go and send it in again right now. And just kind of leave a testimonial for Anne and today's presentation. Up to 4 attendees that fill out this form will be randomly selected to just win a little gift card as a thank you for attending today's event. And again, just thank you all so much for coming today. Please make use of the additional resources linked in the chat, both from GCC and from our presenter today. And just know that you are not alone here at GCC. So thank you so much again.
There is one question, and it said, if you know somebody who is an adult and they refuse to talk to you, is there any way to interfere? That's really hard. And I have had that happen. I have had to call 911 before, never popular. You can't make somebody. All you can do is do the best you can and make the best effort that you can. And sometimes, I had a cousin kill himself in January, and I reached out to him, and he ghosted me, and I kept on him. But in the end, I did the best that I could do. And, sometimes we win and sometimes we lose, and all we can do is the best we can do. And thank you for caring enough. So I appreciate that question. All right. Thank you, guys. I'm going to read the rest of these chats. I didn't get to read all of them. Oh, I love young adults. You always put a lot in the chat. People my age don't. Anyway. All right, guys. Thank you again for attending. Big hug from me to you. A big hug. Bye now.